Hi Linda, let's start with your portfolio review. Looking forward to it. Okay, so your first shot's a real visual pleaser. Of course, it's amazing how probably sunsets are the most photographed thing in the world, yet they still continue to fascinate us because of the painterly quality of light that fills the sky. And it's very poetic, very romantic, and people love sunsets, and whether you can see the sun or after the sun has actually set. I think you did a great job here. The only thing I would suggest, it's a really easy technical thing, is that we just need to rotate clockwise just a little bit. Now, all editing software allows you to rotate, and probably maybe just 1 degree of rotation. Lightroom CC is what I'm using for this example, but you may use a different editing software to get the same result. Okay, let me show you the before and the after. Now the next thing is I'm always looking at a picture and trying to figure out how do I make it stronger by removing things that are distracting. So this tree is not distracting. These trees are not distracting. This tree is distracting. Mainly because this tree, we don't see the base of it, so there's no metaphor ability. Trees are full and rich with metaphor, of narrative. However, if it's just a branch, then it doesn't really tell anything. So there's 2 things we can do. We can clone stamp it out, or we can just crop it out. Now, if you're using Photoshop or a different app that has good clone stamping capabilities, I would suggest try cloning this out because I really like this area. However, in Lightroom CC, the clone stamp tool is not the best, I'll be honest. So that's why normally I suggest people, if they have the Adobe photography plan that includes both Photoshop and Lightroom, if you go to File, Edit in Photoshop, what that'll do is it'll send the picture straight to Photoshop and you can work on it. And then when you save and close the photo, it sends that image back to your Adobe Lightroom CC album. It's very, very convenient. We're not going to do that for this example. I'm just going to make it nice and quick by cropping out that the offending tree there. Now, by doing that, we've also done another thing that's very important, is whenever we have a tree or an object that is dominant, for example, this is the dominant tree in this picture, we try the best that we can to get it somehow intersecting on the rule of thirds. Now, if you can see these tic-tac-toe grids, we have a vertical here, horizontal, and horizontal. If possible, try to get your primary subject or your main visual element to get as close to a intersecting point as possible. So for example, there's an intersecting point here of the vertical and horizontal rule of thirds lines. And that is pretty close to where we want it with regards to this tree. So let's accept this crop. And now we have what we would call a classically followed composition where this tree is sort of at the intersecting points of the rule of thirds. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And one other thing is that you do want to get rid of this. I'm not sure what it is. It could be a twig from a tree. Like I said, Lightroom's cloning is really not that good, but let's see what happens if we give it a try. Well, that's actually not bad. You can see a little bit of artifacts there. That's why, like I said, I try not to use the clone stamping in Lightroom CC very much, but in a pinch, it's there if you need it. Okay, let's get to your next picture. Now, for this shot, I really think it's great that you got the animals so well. It's very rare that you can get so close to them. My only suggestion for this shot is that we just need to warm it up a little bit. So let's warm it up by going to temperature. And again, you can use temperature is in pretty much every editing software possible out there. And it's either called temperature or it's called white balance, and you're just going to want to go to the yellow side instead of the blue side. Also, I feel this image would do well with a little bit of black deepening. So under light, we're not going to go to shadows, but we're going to go to blacks. Let's take the blacks down. Now, what happens with blacks is that the black or the dark, very dark areas, like part of the animal's coat, some of the shadows, they get darker and darker. And this is good because those dark areas add drama to the picture, but the rest of the picture remains untouched, which is also really good. Now we have a little problem with the blown out highlights here. It's not that bad. So what we would do is, there's two things we can do. If we want to get rid of the highlights in the whole picture, this is the easiest way. It's called a global adjustment. We would go to highlights and we would just reduce the highlights. Now watch what happens to this little grouping of flowers when I reduce the highlights. Do you see how prior it had a lot of whiteness, but if we reduce the highlights, a little bit more detail comes into the picture, which is exactly what we want. And that was the same up here and on the horns, the antlers right here. However, I will say that a better way to do this, if your software allows for it, is called targeted adjustments. For example, we're going to use the brush. Our highlights will take down to -30 or -40. And all we're going to do is brush on the reduction in highlights in the areas that we feel we need it. For example, maybe right here. And the value of this is that it doesn't reduce the highlights in the entire picture, because really the entire picture doesn't need it. Targeted adjustments are usually preferable than what we call global adjustments, usually. Now sometimes you need a global adjustment, and the global means that the entire picture will be adjusted, especially if you just want a different white balance for the entire shot. However, if you're dealing with situations where you just want to correct a little area of the picture, then that's where these brush tools come in really handy. Okay, so that's good. Let's get to your next picture. Looks like a Canadian moose. And for this shot, let me see what happens if we go to bring up the shadows. I may be tempted to do the exact opposite with this picture. Now in the previous one, or maybe it was the first one, I suggested that you bring the blacks down to make the blacks even darker. However, we're in a situation with high contrast light. I'm tempted in this shot to actually make sure that the shadows are a little bit brighter, so I can see the texture of the coat of the moose. And in this time, I would certainly do a global highlights reduction. Okay, so that means when I say the word global, it means the entire picture is getting a highlight reduction. Let's try it. Okay, just see how we're seeing more detail now in the animal's coat here. A reduction in highlights and an increase in shadows will even out the overall exposure of the picture. Not really exposure, but it'll even out the picture so that we can actually appreciate the brightness areas and the darkness areas equally. Let's look at the before. Now let's look at the after. What do you think? I think that the after allows us to appreciate the scene and the animal just a touch more. Okay, let's get to your next shot. Okay. So, what I see in this picture is HDR. Now HDR, high dynamic range, is a situation where we take 3 or 2 pictures and stack them together when we have a situation where we have super bright areas and dark areas. And often sunsets are difficult because you're exposing either for the sky, that means your land will be dark, or you're exposing for the land, that means that your sky will be too bright. So your inclination to use HDR for this picture was a very good one. The only thing I can think of is that this picture was just way, in the natural, it was just far too contrasty for your camera to handle it. And this may have been either an iPhone or an Android picture. And you know, like even the latest iPhone or the latest and greatest Android with a Leica lens, they still will struggle with super bright areas and super dark areas, even though they have the benefit of HDR. And I think that in this picture, it's not your fault. It's just that it's not, there's too much difference in dark and bright areas for it to really shine out as a good picture. And I can see that because we can see what's called banding in the clouds. To see how there's like a band or not a circle, but there's the varying degrees of color, and that's usually a telltale sign that it's just too much information for your sensor to handle. And iPhone and Android sensors are, of course, quite small. Anyway, how would I fix this? Well, I would make it a black and white. And whenever there's a situation where the camera can't handle the amount of data because of super brightness or super darkness, I just say, well, no problem. I'll just salvage the picture by making it a black and white. However, before we do that, we just want to straighten your photo, okay? And we want to make it follow the rule of thirds. So I'm going to radically change the composition so that the greenery is on the bottom third and the sky is on the top two thirds. And I love panoramics, so that's why I'm keeping this as a panoramic. I don't actually mind the waterway here. In fact, I kind of like it. I don't mind the tree. I like that as well. Okay, the next thing is that, let's just move in on this picture here. I know that you tried to clone stamp something out. Was this a barn? Was it a power line? Just watch, be careful of the clone stamping. And you may find that apps like Photoshop Fix or Touch Retouch will do a better job at clone stamping. I also see a clone stamp here and here, so just be careful of that. And also a clone stamp job here that needs to just be, you have to be a bit more careful about that. Okay, so let's take the picture out. Now, the easiest way to make a black and white, of course, is to reduce saturation to 0. Okay? Now, when we do that, what happens is that the ugliness of what we call banding, the digital artifacts of the sky, they almost go away. Now, you can still see a little bit of them, but it's not as bad as when it was with color. Let me show you again. This is the color shot, but when we take out the color and we have a pure black and white, we definitely can salvage pictures that are just technically not working for us. Okay, so that's what I would suggest. And if you want to try a bunch of different black and whites, then Lightroom CC has a really good black and white section where you can adjust channels, and also has very good presets for black and white where you can go through a whole bunch of different options. Now, for this particular shot, I really think the easiest is the best, where we simply just took your saturation down to nothing. Okay, let's see what else we have. Your last picture. Now this shot, when I let's take a look at it here, it is a little bit, it exhibits a little bit of camera shake. So your shutter speed was not fast enough, and you can remedy that by increasing your ISO for this picture. So just make sure that your shutter speed is fast enough to get a good sharp shot. I can tell that the head is a little bit shaky, and also the bird's feathers. So, but still, what can you do to help that? Well, make it a black and white. It's a simple solution, and it usually works well. Whenever you have a situation where you have an animal or a place or a thing that's technically not good because it's either blurry or it's you know, maybe the sensor couldn't pick up all the light differences, well, just make it a black and white, and usually that will take your photo out of the garbage bin, or out of the potential garbage bin, and it'll actually make it somewhat acceptable. So that's what I would suggest for this picture, is make it a black and white, and and the fact that it's slightly blurry has less less value. There's less concern that it has slight blur. Okay, so that is it. Linda, thank you so much for sending me your photos for your portfolio review. I really enjoyed going through your photos.